diligent observers of the Marvel Universe know that Thor has only one weapon that he uses, and that's a hammer. It's much bigger than this one, and only he can swing it. But that's all he ever uses, and he uses it pretty effectively. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had a toothache and went to my dentist office, and all of a sudden he came in, Thor did, and said, "Good morning, I'm Thor, I'm your new dental hygienist. What seems to be the problem?" And he had his hammer in his hand. I might run out of there, because I think I might want my precious teeth to be managed by something a little more delicate than a hammer like this. And yet that's the only tool he knows how to use. For that matter, if I took my car to a mechanic, I'd hope the mechanic had more tools in his toolbox than a hammer like this. I'd hope that would be true of a tool and die maker, or a carpenter, or almost anybody else, you know, because a one-tool guy is, you know, I don't know. Sometimes Christians are kind of like that with Bible verses. You get one or two of them and think we're good. And it's like, yeah, sometimes those Bible verses are pretty good, and Thor could certainly do a lot of good with his hammer, but, you know, sometimes the Bible verse isn't exactly appropriate for what you want. And sometimes it's not only inappropriate, it's, I don't know, uncalled for. Like, for instance, when I was a kid growing up at Luther Memorial School in Cleveland, we had to learn Bible verses. And one of the ones from the Psalms was this one. "Call upon me in every trouble, says the Lord. I will deliver you and you will glorify me." Now that's a pretty good Bible verse, but you know, if that turns out to be a one-hammer Bible verse, and you use it in every circumstance for everything, and you tend to go around and talk to people and say, you know, you find somebody who's in trouble, somebody who's suffering, somebody who's in pain, somebody who's undergoing some kind of distress, and you say, "The Lord promises, call upon me in every trouble, I will deliver you and you will glorify me." And it just doesn't work all the time, because the Lord doesn't always deliver people, even when they call upon Him. He doesn't always deliver them the way they would expect. You need a few more tools in the toolbox than just call upon me in every trouble, I will deliver you and you will. That's why the Bible has hundreds of Bible verses, because it's, you know, like that, for one thing. For instance, the disciples in the boat in the gospel lesson, you know, they get in the boat, Jesus sends them in the boat across the lake so he can stay to pray. They get in there in the middle of the night in the lake, and the sea kicks up, and it's rough, and it's kicking them around, and the waves are coming in, and it's swamping the boat, and they're struggling against the wind and the waves. And Jesus, in the wee hours, starts walking across the water, right, to get to the boat, and they think they see a ghost, and they're totally terrified, which is another sermon, and so they don't know what to do. "Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you will glorify me." Now, if this were a Hollywood version of this, or something that we might anticipate, what would we think that Jesus should do for them, or that God should do for them to deliver them from their predicament? Well, based on the previous experience from the last time they were in a boat and it stormed and Jesus was there, one might think that Jesus would command the wind and the waves, "Stop and be still." But he doesn't do that. The waves are calling, Jesus is walking, they're in a panic. What else might we expect? If this were Hollywood, we might expect that Jesus would perform a miracle, like levitate the whole boat out of the water and float it gently through the air to the dry ground. You know, which would be a wonderful miracle that all the people waiting on shore would be willing to see and say, "Look what Jesus did," and besides all the healing and all that other stuff, it should add to his reputation. Didn't happen. Some Christians might expect that Jesus would simply look at those 12 disciples and say, I think I'm just going to rapture you out of this dangerous situation right now, just pluck them out of the boat and put them somewhere nice and safe. Didn't happen either. Or maybe Jesus would say to them, if he were living in this day and age, maybe Jesus would say to them, okay guys, I see that you're really tense right now. I think what you need to do is just relax and do some yoga. That didn't happen either. What did happen? The storm continued, and Jesus got into the boat with them. He was literally in the same boat with the disciples. And only when he joined them in their predicament, in their difficulty, in their storm, in their distress, only once he joined them in their distress did the storm settle down. See, the deliverance that we might have expected didn't happen. But Jesus came and joined them in their distress. Keep that in mind. Because that sometimes is what we need to say to people who are suffering or in distress or in pain or sorrow. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Doesn't mean that he takes them away always and gets rid of them always. Sometimes it means that he's right there with us, and he's right next to us, and he is carrying them with us. Here's another one that often gets used, and it has its place sometimes. The verse that St. Paul wrote is, God will not let you be tested beyond what you are able, but when you are tested, he provides a way of escape. Now, a lot of times what I hear is people retranslate that as, God won't give you more than you can handle. At which point I want to say, hold on now, that's not what it said. Because then people come up with, God won't give you more than you can handle, and they use it at inappropriate times, and I really get upset with that, because I want to say, okay, let's talk about people who have had homes who've been destroyed in the California wildfires, and I look at Christians. I want to say to Christians who are staring at the smoldering remains of their homes and say, so what do you think? As you're looking at the smoldering remains of your home, and God's saying to you, you know what, I know your home was destroyed, but you can handle that, right? I don't think so. Or what about, so do we go to a Christian who's been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer and say, I know this happened to you, but God's looking at you saying, I know you can handle that, so it's okay, right? Or do we go to a Christian who's just lost a loved one to suicide and say, God says, I gave that to you because I know you can handle it, right? And that makes no sense at all from a God who is a loving, compassionate, and wonderful God. No sense at all. So I wish people wouldn't say, God won't give you more than you can handle. Because what the Bible passage says is, God won't test us beyond what we're able, but in our testing, he will give us a way of escape. And that's not a Thor hammer kind of passage. That's one to use very selectively in very certain kinds of circumstances. And not in all circumstances, because it's not a universal promise. It's just a very selective kind of thing. And here's where it doesn't work. It didn't work a couple of weeks ago, for instance, when we were in Bible class, we were talking about the 3 men in the fiery furnace. You should have been there. In fact, it's an advertisement for Bible class. If you didn't, you should be there on Sunday mornings. Next week is Daniel and the Lion's Den, by the way, so you should come. But we talked about the 3 men in the fiery furnace a couple of weeks ago. Good Sunday school story. So here you have it. You got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 nice Jewish men, and they're faithful Jewish guys. They're faithful to the Lord, but they're also quite highly placed in the government of Babylon. And they're doing well at their jobs. But somewhere along the line, King Nebuchadnezzar, who sometimes gets these weird ideas, has this notion to build this huge idol and make everybody bow down and worship it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, we're not going to do it, and even though they know that the penalty for not worshiping the idol is they're going to be thrown in the fiery furnace. So they refuse to worship, they get arrested, brought before the king, and the king says, don't you understand that you're going to get thrown in the fiery furnace, and your God isn't going to be able to save you? And they say to the king, we believe that our God can save us from the fiery furnace, but even if he chooses not to do that, we're still not going to worship your stupid idol. Well, the king gets all upset about this, has some of his guards tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and has others of his guards fire up the fiery furnace till it's 7 times hotter than it was before, and then he has his guards pitch the boys in. At which point, the guards who are pitching them in are struck dead by the heat of the furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go in the furnace, and they're fine. The ropes disintegrate in the fire, but these guys are fine. Their clothes are fine, they're fine, not a hair of their head is singed, etc. And Nebuchadnezzar looks in the furnace from a distance away, and he says to all the people that are around him, he says, look, we threw 3 guys in the furnace, but there's 4 of them walking around in there. Where'd that 4th guy come from? And he looks like a son of the gods. Whoa. There's a debate, by the way, as to whether this son of the gods is an angel or is it Jesus. So for our purposes today, I'll settle the debate. It's Jesus. So anyway, he's there with them. Till finally Nebuchadnezzar says, well, let them out. So they come out, they're fine, their clothes are fine, their hair is fine, their beards are fine. And Nebuchadnezzar's like, now we know that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the God of heaven and earth. Well, here's the point. The Bible passage that St. Paul wrote says, in our testing, God will provide a way of escape. Well, what one escape did he provide for them? What escape might he have provided? What escape might we have anticipated that he would have provided for these guys in the furnace? Well, if this were Hollywood, here's what we might have anticipated. We might have anticipated, if this were Hollywood, that the grate at the bottom of the furnace would have been loose. They could have stomped on it, popped it open, and jumped down through the bottom and escaped. Didn't happen. Or we might have anticipated that they would see that there were bolts at the back of the furnace. They could loosen the bolts, sneak out through the back of the furnace, and get out that way, James Bond style. Didn't happen. Or if this were even Cecil B. DeMille style Hollywood, we might anticipate that there would be a sudden thunderstorm and God would dump a whole bunch of rain down on the furnace and just drown out the fire in a big flood of rain all of a sudden. And that would save them. Didn't happen. Or maybe God would blow a mighty wind from his mouth with his breath and blow out the fire, just as the guys were put into it. Didn't happen. That would be wonderful. That would prove that God knew what he was doing, right? And that he was the great God of all. That didn't happen either. If this were Hollywood style of these days, we might anticipate that one of the guys would suddenly discover that he had flu powder in his pocket and that they would disapparate themselves from there to Diagon Alley, Harry Potter style. That didn't happen either. Because prayer is not magic words. You don't say a prayer, point your magic wand, and make God do whatever it is you want him to do. That's not how it works. What happened was, they were thrown into the fiery furnace, and in their distress, Jesus joined them. And he was with them as long as they were in there. He did not bring them out. Nebuchadnezzar, who put them into distress to begin with, was the one who brought them out. But Jesus joined them in there. And when they came out, he was done. He was gone. Nebuchadnezzar brought them out, not Jesus. Interesting to think about it that way. Jesus didn't do any miracles. He didn't do any miracles that we would expect. He just joined them in their distress. He joined them in their suffering. He joined them in that torturous place. Kept them safe in there, yes. But they came out okay because the King brought them out. They were okay because Jesus kept them safe. That's the bigger promise. You know, there are scripture passages that promise all kinds of things. They promise He'll provide a way of escape. They promise He'll deliver and we will glorify. And those are good promises to keep in the toolbox when we need them on certain occasions. But they're not be-all and end-all, Thor-hammer kind of things that we can use for everything. There is a promise, though, that says that we have the presence of Jesus with us and will be with Him always, ultimately, but not in the way that we might expect in this life. Over there on the wall we have the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters, and so forth and so on. You know, there's a line in there that says, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. It doesn't say, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil because you'll take me out of the valley. You know? You're not, you know, I won't be afraid of anything because I know that suddenly, you know, you're going to turn the valley of the shadow of death into Sunshine Mountain. That's why I won't be afraid. It doesn't work that way. I won't be afraid even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death because I know that in that valley you'll be with me. That's the promise. That's part of the promise anyway. Part of the promise that otherwise sounds like this. Surely He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. And that goes like this. In ancient Jerusalem, there are two men. They're criminals. And they're sentenced to be executed. And they know that that's what they deserve because they've done crimes for which death is the penalty. So they've resigned themselves to the fact that they're going to be executed. They're going to be marched out of Jerusalem and they're going to be executed by Roman soldiers. That's the plan. So they're marched out of Jerusalem to the place of execution. They're taken by the Roman soldiers. They're nailed to crosses, which is the form of execution. Horrible and torturous, but that's the deal. And they know that, and they're nailed to crosses. And somehow, curiously, in between them, there's a third cross that's erected there. And on that cross, they begin to nail, these Roman soldiers begin to nail a third guy who isn't part of the criminal element in Jerusalem. They both recognize this. He's a guy that they both don't really know as a criminal, but they've heard rumors about him. They've heard that he's a good guy. They've heard that he's done a lot of good things for a lot of people. And they've heard it said that he's been framed by the Jewish leaders and that the Jewish leaders manipulated the Roman governor into sentencing him to death and so forth and so on. And there he is between the two of them who do deserve to die. And they're really puzzled about this. In the meantime, people are coming and going down below them on the ground. And the Jewish leaders are particularly saying to this third guy, if you are the Son of God, get off that cross and save yourself. And one of the criminals in his torture and agony says, yeah, if you're the Son of God, why don't you save yourself and us too while you're at it? Well, if he is the Son of God, then what happens to call upon me in the day of trouble and I will deliver you and you'll glorify me? Or even what happens to He'll provide a way of escape. Here's what doesn't happen. God does not smite the Roman soldiers so that they all fall down dead and the disciples could come and rescue everybody. The crosses don't suddenly dissolve into thin air so that the men just drop off the crosses and run away. There's not suddenly an attack by a SWAT team of disciples that overpowers the Roman soldiers and rescues the three of them from the cross. Or angels, for that matter. None of that happens. Even the Roman soldiers are not necessarily overcome by a sudden sense of guilt and take them down on their own. That doesn't even happen. And they begin to realize this. They are going to die on those crosses. And so one of the criminals eventually turns to the one in the middle and says, instead of, if you are the Son of God, why don't you come down off the cross and save yourself and us too? He turns to the one in the middle and says to him, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus in the middle says to him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. There's no rescue, there's no deliverance, there's no whatever else you might want to call it. But surely he has borne our griefs, and surely he has carried our sorrows. And on that day, the three of them died together. Jesus dies with him and the other. And because Jesus dies like we die, because God the Father raised him on the third day on Easter Sunday, the promise is that we will also be raised when he comes again in glory. And that those of us who turn to him like the criminal did on the cross, say, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom, we also will be in paradise with him. That's the promise. That's the overarching promise. Not that God will rescue us in this life, or that he will help us escape in this life, or give us deliverance always in this life. But the overarching, the big promise is this, that because Jesus died as we die, we also will live as he lives. Not only in rising from the dead, but in living with him in paradise forever. That's the big promise. That's where it is. So when we are suffering, when we find somebody who is suffering, when we're having difficulties, when we're in distress, it may be that we do not get deliverance in this life or relief in this life. It may be that the best we can do is say, but Jesus is right here with us on the cross, or has been right here with us on the cross. It may be that the best we can do is to say, surely he has borne these same griefs and carried these same sorrows, even to his death. But even in that death, his promise is, you will be with him in paradise. And when he returns again in glory, we will be with him in that same glory forever. In Jesus' name.